Right now, you can name what's wrong with your mind. You have a word for anxiety, for depression, for hearing voices that aren't there. You can walk into a building, sit across from a stranger, and describe the inside of your own head. But for almost all of human history, none of those words existed. There was no doctor for the mind. There was no diagnosis. There was just a person acting strange and a village that had to decide what to do about them. And what they decided is far older and far stranger than you'd expect. Most people assume our ancestors simply feared the mentally ill and threw them out. But that's only half the story, and the other half might change how you see your own mind. Let's go back to the very beginning. About 7,000 years ago, someone took a sharp stone and cut a hole into a living human skull. The person was awake. The hole was the size of a coin. This procedure has a name: trepanation. And here's what's strange: the patients survived. We know because the bone around the holes healed, smooth, and rounded, which only happens if the person lived for months or years afterward. Thousands of these skulls have been found across Europe, across South America, across the Pacific. Some skulls have not one hole, but seven. Seven separate operations on the same head, all healed. So why would anyone do this? The leading theory is that they were trying to let something out: a spirit, a demon, a pressure inside the skull that made a person rage, or seize, or speak in tongues. To the ancient mind, madness wasn't in the brain. It was a thing that had crawled inside you. And if a thing crawled in, you could carve a door to let it leave. But here's where it gets bigger. The ancient world didn't always treat that invading spirit as a curse. Sometimes it was a gift. In ancient Greece, they had a word: the sacred disease. It was their name for epilepsy, for fits and seizures, and trembling. They believed a person mid-seizure was being touched by the gods. Then, around 400 BC, one man pushed back. In his own words, the physician Hippocrates wrote that the sacred disease is not any more divine nor more sacred than other diseases. He argued it came from the brain, not the heavens. That single sentence is one of the oldest attempts in history to pull madness down out of the supernatural and into the body. But almost no one listened for the next 2,000 years, because there was a simpler explanation, and it was everywhere. If a strange spirit got in, the answer was to drive it out. Across the ancient world, this took the same shape again and again. In ancient Mesopotamia, priests called ashipu would diagnose which specific demon or angry god had seized a person. They had names for the demons, they had rituals, chants, and offerings to match each one. The mentally ill weren't sent to a hospital, they were sent to a temple. In ancient Egypt, the sick slept inside temple grounds in a practice called incubation, waiting for a healing dream. This wasn't cruelty, this was the closest thing they had to care. And that's the part most people miss. We picture our ancestors chaining the mad in the dark, and sometimes they did. But for thousands of years, the dominant response was religious treatment, not punishment. A disturbed person was a spiritual emergency, and the whole community was expected to respond. Then came the turn that made everything darker. As organized religion hardened in medieval Europe, the spirit inside you stopped being a random demon. It became a sign that you had let evil in, that you had sinned, or made a pact, or invited the devil himself. Madness was no longer a sickness to be healed. It was guilt to be punished, and the person hearing voices was no longer a patient. They were a suspect. This is the era that built the asylums. In 1247, a London priory was founded with a name that would echo for centuries: Bethlehem. Over time, its name was slurred down by ordinary people into a single word. That word was bedlam, a word we still use today to mean total, screaming chaos. By the 1700s, Bethlehem was charging visitors a penny to walk inside and stare at the inmates for entertainment. People brought their children. The mad had become a zoo exhibit. Most people hear all this and reach the obvious conclusion. They think, our ancestors were ignorant and we are wise, that we replaced superstition with science and finally got it right. But that is not quite the lesson, because the deepest thread running through all of this isn't the chains, or the holes, or the demons. It's the loneliness. For almost the entire human story, a suffering mind was met by other people: a priest who knew your demon's name, a temple that took you in, a whole village that agreed something real was happening to you, even if they were wrong about what. You were never just a chemical imbalance to be medicated alone. You were a person something had happened to, and your people gathered around it. We finally have the science our ancestors lacked. We can name the disorder, map the brain, and prescribe the right molecule. But somewhere along the way, the village dissolved. Today, you can have the exact diagnosis they never had, and still face it more alone than a Stone Age patient with a hole in his skull. They had the wrong answers and the right instinct. So the next time your own mind turns strange in the dark, remember what we kept, and remember what we quietly let go of. They didn't have a word for it, but they never let you face it by yourself.